Okay, let's get right into it. It's Monday, March 16th, 2026, and we're now in the third week of a war that was supposed to be over in an hour. An hour. Instead, it's become a crisis that is, right now, actively tearing down the world as we know it.
So, what we're going to break down today is a catastrophic miscalculation. I mean, really catastrophic. What was sold as Operation Epic Fury, a quick, clean, one-hour decapitation strike on Iran, has completely fallen apart. Now, on day 17, it's a brutal, high-intensity war of attrition. And it's not just a regional conflict anymore, it's a global shockwave, and it's shaking the very foundations of, well, everything.
Right, so first off, let's talk about the expanding battlefield. The idea that this could be kept neat and tidy, contained to just one or two countries, that's completely out the window. This thing has spilled over its borders in a huge way, and what we have now is this sprawling, chaotic war zone that seems to be pulling in new players almost every single day.
And when I say sprawling, I mean it. Just look at this list. We're talking about strikes being reported in at least 10 different countries and territories. From Iran and Israel to Lebanon, Iraq, Cyprus, all the way down the Gulf to Saudi Arabia and Oman. The entire Middle East and even parts of its periphery have been turned into a massive, multi-front war.
And of course, the human cost is it's staggering. More than 1,400 people killed. And you have to remember that number is just the reported figure from inside Iran, from the US and Israeli attacks. The real number is likely much higher.
At the same time, this whole thing has reignited the war in Lebanon. It's a tragedy unfolding all over again, with another 850 people reported killed there due to Israeli aggression.
And look at the knock-on effect of that. We're now facing a massive new humanitarian crisis. We're talking about roughly 700,000 people displaced in Lebanon. That's nearly 750,000 people forced from their homes, just like that.
You know, if you want a sense of just how fast this is escalating, just look at the last 72 hours. It's relentless. On the 13th, Turkey, a NATO member, intercepts an Iranian missile. Same day, a strike in northern Israel injures dozens. The 14th, a U.S. airbase in Saudi Arabia gets hit, damaging 5 tanker planes. Yesterday, an Italian drone is shot down over Kuwait, and through it all, Iran launches its 54th wave of retaliatory attacks. 54th. There's no off-ramp here. This is just spiraling.
So, okay, this might feel like it's a world away, but here's where it starts to directly impact you and me and everyone, no matter where we live. It all comes down to one critical choke point, the Strait of Hormuz. The world's economic artery has just been severed.
For years, there was this threat. Would Iran ever actually close the Strait of Hormuz? Well, they just did. It's done. This narrow waterway is where a huge chunk of the world's oil and gas has to pass through. By closing it, Iran has essentially put a blockade on all of its Gulf neighbors. And the result? An immediate, massive shock to the global economy.
And this isn't some analyst's prediction for next month. This is happening now. Qatar is already warning that the Gulf will have to stop all energy exports within days. That's not a drill. The tap has been turned off, and we're just starting to feel the first of the ripple effects.
Okay, now we get to how a world scrambles for resources. This is where things get really wild. Analysts are calling what's happening a butterfly effect. You know the idea. A butterfly flaps its wings in one part of the world and causes a hurricane somewhere else. Well, a military action in the Persian Gulf is now causing systemic failures in sectors that you would never, ever think are connected.
And here is a perfect, almost unbelievable example. Follow this chain of events. The blockade starts in the Gulf. That halts natural gas exports from Qatar. Well, it turns out that helium is a byproduct of that natural gas production. So suddenly, there's a global helium shortage. And why does that matter? Because without helium, you can't cool the magnets in MRI machines. So now all over the world, hospitals are finding their MRI scanners are becoming useless. A naval blockade is directly causing a healthcare crisis. It's insane.
And that's just one example. The consequences are cascading everywhere. We're staring down the barrel of a global food shock, maybe even worse than what we saw after the Ukraine invasion in 2022. Fertilizer shortages are threatening farmers everywhere. India and Nepal are already rationing gas. Oil prices, they're going through the roof, which means inflation for everyone. And on top of it all, U.S. missile interceptor stockpiles are running dangerously low. The entire global system is under a level of strain we haven't seen in our lifetimes.
So with all of this chaos, military, economic, humanitarian, as the backdrop, We have to pull the camera back and ask a much, much bigger question. What does all this mean for the so-called rules-based order? You know, the entire system that's more or less governed the world since the end of World War II?
There's a geopolitical analyst who put it perfectly, and it's a chilling thought. They said, "We are now walking at a cemetery of world orders. We just have a fresh tomb." Think about that. We're not just challenging the foundational systems of international law and cooperation. We're actively burying them.
And we're seeing every single pillar of that old order just cracking and crumbling right before our eyes. Conventional deterrence? It failed. The stockpiles of interceptors are almost gone. International institutions like the UN? Totally bypassed, especially after the US pulled out of so many related organizations. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty? It's on life support. Countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia are probably thinking right now that they need their own bomb. And then there's this new, really dangerous dynamic. Reports that Russia and China are acting as a hidden hand, feeding targeting intel to Iran. That just throws gasoline on the fire.
Which leaves us with the final, deeply unsettling question. What comes next in a world without rules? Because that's where we are. The old order is gone. Its tomb has been freshly dug in the deserts of the Middle East. And what it's leaving behind is a massive, dangerous power vacuum, and a future that is completely and, frankly, frighteningly unwritten.
Right now, it takes an Iranian teenager with a $500 virtual reality headset and like a consumer-grade quadcopter duct taped to an RPG warhead to just completely neutralize a $2 billion American amphibious assault ship.
Yeah, it's the ultimate inversion of military power. The entire architecture of 20th century warfare, the massive, slow-moving platforms, the concentrated troop deployments.
Right, the whole reliance on overwhelming technological superiority.
Exactly. It's all colliding with this 21st century reality where cheap, eponymous, mass-produced lethality is just, well, it's dictating the terms of engagement now.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. It is the morning of Monday, March 16th, 2026. And if you are, waking up and checking the news, you already know the entire world is watching the Middle East right now.
Yeah, that's impossible to ignore.
But we're not here to just give you a play-by-play of the overnight airstrikes. The mission today is to unpack a rapidly escalating crisis that geopolitical analysts, historians, they're all already calling it the definitive end of the post-1945 world order.
Which is a heavy phrase, but it's accurate based on the latest intelligence stack we've been going through.
Exactly. We've spent the last 48 hours combing through journalist reports on the ground, geopolitical assessments, a ton of YouTube videos from military experts breaking this down. And what we are looking at is the real-time collapse of Western deterrence, the fracturing of global supply chains, and what many are referring to as the cemetery of international law.
And to really understand the sheer scale of that collapse, you have to look past the official press briefings coming out of Washington right now.
Because the narrative there is very different, right?
Very different. The prevailing narrative over the last 2 weeks has been one of controlled, precise escalation. But the tactical reality, what is actually happening on the ground, in the air, and in the shipping lanes this very minute, tells a completely different story.
Yeah.
We are witnessing the stress testing of systems that have governed global security and economics for 80 years. And, well, those systems are failing.
Okay, let's unpack this by first establishing exactly where we are on the timeline. We are currently entering the third week, day 16 to be exact, of the U.S. and Israeli conflict with Iran.
Right, originally dubbed by the Trump administration as Operation Epic Fury.
Operation Epic Fury. Triggered, of course, by that highly controversial decapitation strike that killed the Iranian Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei. And the projection from the administration back then was that this would be, a swift, decisive victory.
A short shock and awe campaign to just shatter the Iranian government's command and control.
Right. But as the last 48 hours of tactical movements clearly show, that is absolutely not what happened. Instead, a localized kinetic exchange has just spiraled into a global systemic shock.
What's fascinating here is to grasp the magnitude of the fallout, you have to dissect the tactical decisions made over the weekend, starting with the Kharg Island operation.
Which was huge.
Yeah, arguably the most significant escalation since the initial decapitation strike. It perfectly illustrates the high-stakes hostage dynamic currently playing out.
So Kharg Island. For anyone unfamiliar with the geography of the Persian Gulf, Kharg Island isn't just like a piece of rock. It is the absolute heart of Iran's energy sector. We are talking about an island terminal that handles roughly 90% of the country's entire crude oil exports.
90%? Let that sink in.
Yeah. But the details of the U.S. strike over the weekend are what really matter here. The U.S. forces heavily bombarded the island, but they specifically targeted the runway, the surrounding military anti-air facilities, and the island's desalination plant.
Right. They deliberately left the actual oil-loading docks and storage tanks completely intact.
Which is a very specific choice.
It's a classic coercive maneuver. By stripping away the island's military defenses and, crucially, cutting off its fresh water supply but leaving the multi-billion-dollar oil infrastructure standing, Washington is essentially holding Iran's primary economic lifeline hostage.
The implied threat there is pretty unambiguous, right? If Iran does not immediately reopen the Strait of Hormuz to global shipping, those oil facilities, the very lifeblood of their economy, they're the next targets.
Exactly. But the mechanics of how the United States carried out this strike represent an even more volatile escalation.
Right, the launch vectors.
Yeah.
Because the statements coming out of Tehran, and these are backed by regional radar tracking data from analysts online, indicate that this wasn't just a strike launched from a U.S. aircraft carrier sitting safely out in the ocean.
No, the U.S. utilized HIMARS high-mobility artillery rocket systems.
And they fired those rockets from two specific locations situated squarely within the United Arab Emirates. The trajectories originated from near Ras Al Khaimah and Dubai.
Which fundamentally alters the diplomatic geometry of the whole region.
How so?
Well, think about the UAE. They've spent the last decade painstakingly building an economy based on global commerce, tourism, foreign investment. They have desperately tried to maintain a posture of regional neutrality.
Because they know they're vulnerable.
Precisely because they understand their geographic vulnerability. They do not want to be the launch pad for American aggression. But by firing HIMARS from Emirati soil, the U.S. military has effectively dragged a wealthy, highly vulnerable, business-centric Gulf state directly into the crosshairs of a major regional war.
And if the goal of the initial decapitation strike and this new Karg Island bombardment was to force Iran into submission, I mean, the data shows the exact opposite is happening.
Completely the opposite.
Despite President Trump's repeated public claims over the past 2 weeks that the Iranian military has been completely obliterated, Iran just launched its 54th wave of retaliatory attacks.
54 waves in 16 days.
It's unbelievable. And they are actively unveiling new Sagil solid-fuel ballistic missiles. And they're consistently hitting their targets. They're striking inside Israel, and they are landing blows on U.S. military bases spread across Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and now the UAE.
Yeah.
You have to ask, if their command structure was supposedly destroyed on day 1, how are they sustaining this level of coordinated firepower on day 16?
Because the entire U.S. operational assessment was based on a flawed mirror image understanding of how militaries function.
What do you mean by mirror image?
Well, the Pentagon operates on a highly centralized command and control doctrine. You cut off the head, the body dies. That's how we fight. But Iran has spent the last 40 years designing a military architecture specifically tailored to survive a massive American first strike. They operate on a principle of extreme decentralization.
Oh, so they don't have, like, a single Pentagon-style building that controls everything?
Exactly. They've constructed hundreds of deeply buried self-sufficient missile cities tunneled into the Zagros Mountains.
I've seen videos of those. They look like subway systems just packed with missiles.
That's exactly what they are. Subterranean complexes equipped with independent power generation, pre-programmed targeting data, and autonomous launch authorizations. The local commanders down there do not need a phone call from Tehran to execute their mission. Furthermore, a massive portion of their arsenal consists of pre-programmed drone swarms. You can launch a Shahed drone from the back of a modified commercial pickup truck, fire it, and drive away before the missile even leaves the launch rail.
Right, shoot and scoop.
Exactly. And the fact that U.S. bases like the Ali al-Salem base in Kuwait are taking direct hits right now proves that Iran's retaliatory capacity remains largely intact and highly operational.
Which brings us to the U.S. reaction to this continuous grinding barrage. We are seeing major troop movements being initiated by the Pentagon right now.
Massive movements, yeah.
They are currently deploying a Marine Expeditionary Unit that's roughly 5,000 troops, and they are preparing to surge a third aircraft carrier, the USS George H.W. Bush, into the theater. But what really caught my eye, and what all the military analysts on YouTube are fixated on, is the movement of the assets already in the region.
The Abraham Lincoln.
Yes. Satellite imagery over the weekend revealed that the USS Abraham Lincoln, one of the carriers actively engaged in this conflict, has actually retreated. It moved over 1,000 kilometers away from the Persian Gulf,
Repositioning itself off the coast of Oman.
literally hiding behind a coastal mountain range.
And that 1,000-kilometer retreat is arguably the most revealing tactical indicator of this entire war so far. It exposes the fatal flaw in American naval power projection against a peer or near-peer adversary.
I mean, why does a multi-billion-dollar supercarrier run away from the fight?
Because the U.S. Navy is acutely aware of the capabilities of Iran's anti-ship ballistic missiles and their newly developed hypersonic glide vehicles.
Okay, let's break down the physics of why that is so terrifying for a ship commander. Like, what's the difference between this and a normal missile?
Well, a traditional cruise missile flies relatively low and slow. A ship's Aegis radar system has time to spot it, track it, and fire interceptors. But an anti-ship ballistic missile leaves the atmosphere, travels through space, and comes down vertically on the target at speeds exceeding Mach 10.
Mach 10, that's just, you can't even comprehend that speed.
And a hypersonic glide vehicle maneuvers unpredictably through the upper atmosphere at similar speeds. The radar horizon of a ship only gives the defense systems mere seconds to react.
To seconds.
Yeah. In the confined, shallow waters of the Persian Gulf or the Strait of Hormuz, an aircraft carrier is a massive, incredibly expensive sitting duck.
So they move it 1,000 kilometers away to keep it out of the threat ring. But here is the massive logical contradiction in that strategy that I saw pointed out. An FA-18 Super Hornet, the primary fighter jet on that carrier, has an unrefueled combat radius of roughly 700 to 800 kilometers.
Right.
If the aircraft carrier is hiding 1,000 kilometers away to avoid being sunk, its own fighter jets cannot reach the targets in Iran and make it back without massive, highly vulnerable aerial refueling operations.
Precisely. They have preserved the ship, but they have effectively neutralized its ability to project power over the battlefield. The asset just becomes a multi-billion-dollar spectator.
That is wild.
And this disconnect between legacy doctrine and modern reality becomes even more glaring when you look at the deployment of that Marine Expeditionary Unit you mentioned.
Right, 5,000 Marines on amphibious assault ships. The operational assumption from the analysts is that they might be used to storm a beach, perhaps to secure Karg Island, or seize control of the coastline along the Strait of Hormuz to stop the missile launches.
But if you look at how warfare has evolved just in the last 76 months, the idea of executing a D-Day-style amphibious landing in 2026 seems like absolute tactical suicide.
It seems insane.
It is entirely unfeasible. We saw the prototype for this exact scenario during the conflict in the Black Sea back in 2022 and 2023. Ukraine, a country with essentially no conventional navy, used cheap, mass-produced, remotely piloted surface and aerial drones to systematically dismantle and sink major portions of the Russian Black Sea fleet.
Now take that Black Sea scenario and multiply the threat density by a factor of 20. Because the Iranian coastline along the Persian Gulf is incredibly rugged. It is thousands of miles of caves, inlets, and mountains.
It's the perfect terrain for hiding two-man drone teams.
Exactly. Imagine a massive, slow-moving U.S. amphibious assault ship trying to approach that coast to offload landing craft. All it takes is 200 Iranian operators sitting miles away in a cave with commercial virtual reality headsets, launching those $500 FPV first-person view drones we talked about in the intro.
Yeah.
They strap a standard RPG warhead to the drone, and they fly it directly into the radar arrays, the communication antennas, and the landing craft of the U.S. ships.
And the ship's close-in weapons systems, you know, the Phalanx Gatling guns and the short-range missiles, they might shoot down the first 50 drones.
Right.
They might even shoot down the first 100. But a swarm of 200 drones converging simultaneously from multiple vectors will simply overwhelm the tracking software and exhaust the ship's physical ammunition magazines in minutes.
It's just a math problem at that point.
Exactly. Once the ship is blind and out of bullets, the remaining drones just detonate against the hull and the troop compartments. The fact that an amphibious assault is even on the table highlights a dangerous institutional inertia within the Pentagon.
They're fighting the last war.
They're trying to fight a 21st century war of attrition using 20th century set-piece tactics.
Which leads us directly into what military strategists are calling the defining crisis of this war for the West. It is the math problem, the interceptor famine.
Yes.
Let's transition to the economics of missile defense here, because when you dig into the mechanics of how the U.S. shoots things down, you realize the entire strategy is economically inverted.
Wars of attrition are not won by the side that fields the most sophisticated technology on the first day of combat. They are won by the side that can sustain its supply lines and manufacturing base on day 100.
Right.
And what we are seeing Iran execute right now is a masterclass in the rope-a-dope strategy.
Oh, exactly like Muhammad Ali fighting George Foreman in the Rumble in the Jungle.
Precisely.
For those who don't know, Ali leaned back against the ropes, kept his guard up, and just let Foreman throw massive energy-draining punches.
Huh.
Foreman exhausted himself trying to land the knockout blow, and once Foreman was totally gassed, Ali went on the offensive.
And Iran is doing the exact same thing. They absorbed the initial decapitation strike. They absorbed the bombardment of Karg Island.
Right.
But in response, they are not throwing their most advanced, expensive weapons right back at the U.S. fleet. They are launching steady, calculated, unending waves of cheap, loitering munitions and older generation, relatively inaccurate ballistic missiles.
And by doing so, they are forcing the United States and Israel to expend their most precious, highly advanced interceptors, specifically the Patriot and Thahad missile systems.
Yeah. THAAD stands for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. It is designed to shoot down short, medium, and intermediate range ballistic missiles in their terminal phase.
The phase right before they hit.
Right. These interceptors are marvels of modern engineering. They are incredibly accurate, but they are also incredibly scarce.
The numbers on this from the reports are staggering. In just the first 15 days of this conflict, the United States has expended 1.5 times more Patriot interceptors in the Middle East than it supplied to Ukraine over the entire multi-year duration of that war.
It's unbelievable.
Wait, really? 1.5 times the volume, burned through in 2 weeks?
In 2 weeks. And here is the fatal flaw in the American defense industrial base. You cannot simply flip a switch and print more Patriot missiles. The U.S. procurement system operates on a mechanism called cost-plus contracting.
Okay, let's break down exactly how cost-plus contracting works, because it really seems to be the root of the problem here.
Sure. So in commercial manufacturing, say, building cars or consumer electronics, the goal is to design a product, optimize the assembly line, and produce it as cheaply and rapidly as possible to maximize profit margins.
Make it efficient.
Right. But in cost-plus defense contracting, the government guarantees the weapons manufacturer that they will cover all the costs of development and production, plus a guaranteed percentage of profit on top of those costs. Oh. So the incentive structure is completely backward.
Completely. If the contractor figures out a way to build a missile for $10,000 using mass-produced, off-the-shelf parts, their profit percentage is tiny.
Right.
But if they design a hyper-complex bespoke missile that costs $4 million to build, requires proprietary software, and takes highly specialized labor to assemble, their guaranteed profit is massive.
Wow. So there is zero financial incentive for defense contractors to build cheap, mass-producible weapons.
Zero. As a result, systems like the Patriot missile are essentially artisanally crafted.
Artisanally crafted missiles. That sounds absurd.
It is, but it's true. They are manually assembled by highly skilled technicians in a handful of facilities. The guidance systems require rare earth minerals and highly specific microchips that have supply chains stretching across the globe.
So how many can they actually make?
Because of this incredibly fragile, slow-moving manufacturing process, the United States only produces roughly 30 to 40 Patriot missiles a month for the entire global stockpile. 30 to 40 a month. And military doctrine dictates that when an incoming ballistic missile is detected on radar, even an old, wildly inaccurate Scud missile from the 1980s, the air defense battery automatically fires 2 to 4 Patriot missiles at that single target to guarantee an interception.
Right, because you can't afford to miss.
So if Iran decides to launch a mixed barrage of just 20 ancient ballistic missiles and 50 cheap drones at a U.S. base in Kuwait, that base will ripple-fire interceptors and easily deplete an entire year's worth of global Patriot production in a single 45-minute engagement.
And once the interceptors run dry, the launchers are just empty metal tubes.
Just sitting there.
The base is completely stripped of its air defense umbrella, and Iran's subterranean factories are still churning out cheap drones.
It is the ultimate asymmetrical nightmare. It is, well, I heard an analyst use this analogy. It's like bringing a solid gold shield to a snowball fight.
That's a great way to put it.
All right, sure, the gold shield is a technological marvel. It is impenetrable. It stops the snowballs perfectly.
Yeah.
But the guys throwing the snowballs have an infinite supply of snow on the ground.
Yeah.
Every time a snowball hits your shield, it costs you $1 million to polish the dent out and recalibrate the grip.
Yeah.
Eventually, you go completely bankrupt just trying to maintain your defense. You have to drop the shield, and then you just get buried in snow. You don't lose the war because your technology was inferior.
No, you lose the war because your economics were fundamentally unsustainable. That snowball analogy captures the exact crisis facing the Pentagon right now. They have prioritized silver bullet platform systems that are devastating in a short, decisive, peer-on-peer conflict, but completely unsuited for a grinding war of attrition.
And this fragility extends beyond the missile defenses to the offensive platforms themselves, too, particularly the F-35 stealth fighter.
Which is heavily deployed across the Gulf bases right now.
Yeah, and the reports coming out about its maintenance are crazy.
While it is arguably the most advanced sensor platform in the sky, it is a logistical nightmare on the ground. The maintenance requirements are astronomical.
Like, how bad are we talking?
For every single hour an F-35 spends in the air, it can require up to 20 hours of highly specialized maintenance on the ground.
20 hours for 1 hour of flight.
Yes.
Right.
The stealth coating has to be constantly repaired. The complex avionics systems require intense diagnostics. But the most alarming factor is who performs that maintenance.
This is a detail that genuinely shocked me when I read it. It's not just uniformed military mechanics turning wrenches on these jets.
No. Due to the proprietary nature of the technology, the defense contracts stipulate that certain software diagnostics, avionics repairs, and propulsion maintenance can only be performed by civilian contractors employed by Lockheed Martin and other defense firms.
Wait, civilian contractors are doing this in a war zone?
Yes. Uniformed military personnel are legally and technically barred from touching certain parts of their own aircraft.
That is insane.
Yeah.
So you have highly paid civilian technicians, people who did not sign up for combat duty, trying to maintain the most complex aircraft on Earth, on flight lines that are actively being targeted by Iranian ballistic missiles and drone swarms.
Exactly. If the contractor evacuation order is given, or if the specialized spare parts supply chain stretching back to Texas is interrupted for even a few days, the entire multi-billion-dollar F-35 fleet in the Middle East becomes grounded.
They just turn into very expensive paperweights.
Which leaves the personnel on those bases incredibly vulnerable. And that vulnerability is compounded by a truly staggering oversight in U.S. military infrastructure in the Gulf.
Right, because if you assume your Patriot shields will never fail, you don't plan for what happens when it does.
Exactly.
Military analysts are reporting that across many of these sprawling U.S. bases and the Gulf bases, housing tens of thousands of American service members, there is a critical lack of hardened underground concrete bunkers.
It is a lethal combination of hubris and budget prioritization. The military command was so supremely confident in the invincibility of their integrated air and missile defense architecture that they simply didn't pour the concrete.
They built above-ground barracks, vulnerable flight lines, soft-skinned command centers, just operating on the assumption that enemy munitions would simply never be allowed to penetrate the airspace.
So picture the scenario we are rapidly approaching right now. A U.S. base in the region fires its absolute last Tachin or Patriot interceptor. The radar screen lights up with a new wave of 50 incoming loitering munitions.
The siren sounds.
And the soldiers look around and realize there is nowhere to physically hide.
That is terrifying.
At that point, the command structure is forced into an impossible decision. We are looking at the very real possibility of mass casualties on a scale not seen since the Vietnam War, or the hurried, humiliating evacuation of American forces from the region.
And if the U.S. military pulls out of the Gulf under fire, they are effectively ceding control of the most vital strategic waterway on Earth. The American security umbrella collapses in real time.
And as that military umbrella folds, the vulnerability immediately bleeds into the economic lifelines of the region.
And this is where the crisis stops being a military thought experiment and starts directly impacting the daily lives of everyone listening to this right now.
Absolutely.
If the military has to retreat or hide, they take their physical protection with them, which means the oil tankers currently sitting in the Persian Gulf suddenly have zero physical defense against those incoming drone swarms. This immediately triggers a panic in the global shipping and insurance markets.
Right.
The Strait of Hormuz is currently, for all practical purposes, closed.
The gravity of the Strait of Hormuz cannot be overstated. It is a narrow choke point between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. At its narrowest point, the shipping lanes are only 2 miles wide in either direction.
Wow, just 2 miles.
Roughly 20 to 30% of the world's total oil consumption and a massive portion of its liquefied natural gas must pass through that specific corridor every single day.
And what's fascinating about modern asymmetric warfare is that Iran didn't even need to execute a complex naval operation to close it.
No.
Like during the tanker wars of the 1980s, Iran and Iraq were physically laying thousands of contact mines in the water, requiring massive international minesweeping armadas to clear the lanes. Today, they don't need mines.
They don't. The mere geographic presence of mobile, shore-to-ship, anti-ship missiles hidden in the mountains overlooking the strait, combined with the proven lethality of their drone swarms, is enough to achieve a total blockade.
Because the maritime insurance market dictates global shipping.
Precisely. A modern supertanker carrying 2 million barrels of crude oil is a massive financial liability.
Yeah, I can't even imagine the premium on that.
If the major insurance syndicates in London decide that the risk of a missile strike is too high, they revoke the war risk insurance coverage. And if you cannot insure the ship does not legally sail. The captains won't risk their crews, and the shipping companies won't risk their assets.
Iran has achieved a total economic blockade through pure asymmetric deterrence.
And this blockade is triggering an existential panic among the Gulf states.
Look at countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. Their entire national economies, their social contracts, their massive sovereign wealth funds, they are all completely predicated on the uninterrupted export of fossil fuels.
The moment those tankers stop moving, their primary source of national income effectively plummets to zero.
But the lack of oil revenue is actually secondary to the immediate terrifying threat they face regarding their basic physical survival.
Right. The physical infrastructure of the modern Gulf states is incredibly fragile.
This was the most jarring realization for me looking at the analysis. We see cities like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, or Doha on television, and we see these glittering, ultra-modern, futuristic metropolises rising out of the sand.
They look invincible.
They do.
Yeah.
But beneath the surface, they're entirely artificial environments operating on a knife's edge.
They are massive, dense populations living in some of the harshest desert environments on the planet. And crucially, countries like Bahrain, Qatar, and the UAE do not have natural underground aquifers or rivers capable of supporting their current populations.
Right.
They rely almost entirely on massive energy-intensive desalination plants for 70 to 100% of their daily drinking water.
Let's talk about how desalination actually works at that scale, because it highlights the vulnerability. You can't just boil a pot of seawater.
No.
These cities use reverse osmosis. They have massive industrial facilities that intake millions of gallons of seawater, and they use immense amounts of electricity, usually generated by burning natural gas, to force that water at incredibly high pressure through semi-permeable membranes to filter out the salt.
It is a continuous high-energy process.
Yeah.
And these cities do not have massive strategic water reserves.
Oh, they don't?
No, they consume the water almost as fast as they produce it. So if Iran decides to make good on its threats to retaliate against the UAE for allowing the U.S. to fire HIMARS from their territory, they don't need to bomb the cities.
They just need to target the power stations running the desalination plants.
Or the water intake valves on the coast.
So if the desalination plants in the UAE stop operating,
Yeah.
how long does the city have?
Within 48 to 72 hours, millions of people would be without potable drinking water in an environment where ambient temperatures routinely exceed 40 degrees Celsius.
Wow. 2 to 3 days.
You would witness a humanitarian catastrophe of unprecedented speed and scale. Thirst drives panic far faster than hunger or physical conflict.
And Iran knows this.
Oh, absolutely.
They have made explicit public threats over the last 2 weeks, stating that if the United States follows through on its threat to destroy Iranian oil infrastructure on Karg Island, Iran will systematically dismantle the energy and water infrastructure of every single U.S. ally in the Gulf.
This is why the panic in the Gulf capitals is absolute right now. They realize the American Patriot umbrella is full of holes, they are trapped in the crossfire, and their entire society is built out of glass.
The strategic calculus of the region has been permanently altered. The Gulf states have realized that being a U.S. ally no longer guarantees their security. In this specific conflict, it actively paints a target on their backs.
Yeah.
And the economic shockwaves of this realization and the physical closure of the strait are already rippling outward to the rest of the globe.
The butterfly effect.
Exactly. Here's where it gets really interesting, because this is where a kinetic strike in the Middle East directly impacts the daily lives of everyone globally. With the strait closed, we are looking at oil futures surging toward $150, perhaps $200 a barrel.
Which is unprecedented.
Aviation fuel surcharges are skyrocketing, which means global air freight is becoming prohibitively expensive. But the energy crisis is just the first domino. Because the global supply chain is hyper-connected and aggressively optimized for just-in-time delivery, this blockade is causing bizarre, catastrophic shortages in fields that seem completely unrelated to Middle Eastern oil.
This is the hallmark of a true systemic shock. It exposes the invisible, hyper-fragile dependencies we take for granted in the modern global economy.
For example, the medical diagnostic supply chain is currently crashing.
Yes.
Hospitals around the world are raising the alarm. Why? Because the entire world relies heavily on the state of Qatar for its supply of liquid helium.
Right. Helium is a byproduct of their massive natural gas extraction facilities. They supercool a gas, extract the helium, liquefy it, put it on specialized cryogenic ships, and send it around the world.
But why is helium so critical? Because of MRI machines, magnetic resonance imaging.
Exactly.
That.
To generate the massive magnetic fields required to scan a human body, an MRI machine uses superconducting coils. And to achieve superconductivity, those coils must be kept at a temperature near absolute zero.
Right. They're bathed in liquid helium. The helium slowly boils off over time and has to be periodically replenished.
And if the hospital doesn't get its regular shipment of Qatari
The
helium,
liquid level drops, the magnets heat up, they lose their superconductivity, a process called a quench, and the machine is essentially dead.
dead. It can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to repair.
So right now, because those cryogenic ships cannot safely exit the Persian Gulf, a drone strike thousands of miles away means a patient in Chicago or London or Tokyo just had their critical cancer screening canceled indefinitely.
It's terrifying, and we're seeing similar, equally devastating systemic failures in global agriculture.
Oh, the fertilizer issue.
Yes, the Gulf region is a massive exporter of the raw materials required to produce modern fertilizers. The Haber-Bosch process, which creates the ammonia used in synthetic fertilizers, requires massive amounts of natural gas.
And when the natural gas exports from the Gulf are locked down, the global supply of fertilizer just plummets.
Agricultural economists are already warning that this looming fertilizer shortage could trigger a global food crisis far worse than the one caused by the supply chain disruptions of 2022 in Ukraine.
If farmers in India or Brazil or the American Midwest cannot source affordable fertilizer, crop yields for the upcoming harvest will plummet. Global food prices will skyrocket within a single growing cycle.
You transition seamlessly from an energy crisis to a medical crisis to a global food security crisis. It really illustrates how the Gulf economies, despite their massive wealth, are essentially one-trick ponies.
They extract hydrocarbons.
They extract hydrocarbons. And the rest of the world has built an imported sustainability model based on the assumption that the United States Navy would always keep the hydrocarbon tap flowing.
And now that the U.S. can no longer guarantee the security of that tap, the entire global South is watching, adapting, and losing faith in Washington as a reliable security guarantor.
Exactly.
And as the United States pours all of its dwindling military resources and political capital into trying to plug the holes in the Middle East, a massive vacuum is opening up in the other major geopolitical theater defining this decade. The drain on Western resources has a direct, profound impact on the war in Ukraine.
It is a zero-sum game of global logistics. The reality of the defense industrial base, as we discussed with the Patriot interceptors, means the United States simply cannot supply the material for two high-intensity wars of attrition simultaneously.
The numbers dictate the policy. Because the U.S. is rapidly exhausting its stockpiles of air defense interceptors to protect Israel and its own bases in the Gulf, Ukraine is effectively being disarmed by default. The pipeline of advanced weaponry heading to Eastern Europe has dried up. There are simply zero interceptors left to send them. By choosing to heavily engage in the Middle East to save a collapsing deterrence posture, the United States has practically abandoned the Ukrainian airspace to Russian forces.
And Russia is fully capitalizing on this strategic pivot. In fact, if you look at the macro geopolitical board, analysts are pointing out that Russia is arguably the single biggest winner of this entire crisis.
They're hitting a strategic jackpot.
Absolutely. Not only is their primary adversary in Europe being systematically starved of vital defensive weapons, but the global panic over the Strait of Hormuz is sending oil and gas prices through the roof.
Which massively enriches Moscow. It is filling their war chest at the exact moment Western sanctions were supposed to be squeezing their economy to the breaking point. The financial pressure has completely evaporated.
And the reports over the weekend even indicate that several European nations, desperate to keep the lights on and avoid a total economic collapse this winter, have quietly resumed buying Russian Arctic liquefied natural gas.
Wow. The sanctions regime is cracking under the pressure of the energy deficit.
It is a profound strategic windfall for President Putin. But Russia is not merely sitting back and passively enjoying the economic benefits. They are actively putting their thumb on the scale in the Middle East. And this introduces the hidden hand aspect of the intelligence assessments we are reviewing today.
Right. Let's dig into the intelligence here because this changes the entire nature of the battlefield.
It does.
U.S. military assessments are showing high confidence that the Iranian strikes against American and Israeli targets are becoming notably sharper over the last few days. The missiles are more accurate. The drone swarms are evading radar defenses more effectively.
And the prevailing theory, backed by significant electronic intelligence gathering, is that Russia and China are providing real-time targeting, radar, and space-based satellite intelligence directly to Iranian forces.
Which fundamentally upgrades Iran's military capability.
Huge upgrade. I mean, Iran has proven they have potent, mass-produced weapons, but a ballistic missile is only as good as its targeting data.
Right, if it can't find the target, it doesn't matter how big the boom is.
Exactly. If you pair Iranian domestic missile production with the space-based surveillance architecture and advanced electronic warfare capabilities of peer-level adversaries like Russia and China, those Iranian weapons become exponentially more lethal. They are no longer firing blind. They are firing with superpower vision.
But looking at this dynamically, I have to point out what seems like a glaring geopolitical hypocrisy here.
Okay.
The U.S. administration is reportedly outraged, issuing furious condemnations about the possibility of Russia providing targeting intel to Iran to hit American assets. But the United States has been openly, proudly providing targeting intel, high-resolution satellite imagery, and logistical support to Ukraine to hit Russian assets for years.
Right.
How does Washington reconcile that?
Well, they cannot easily reconcile it because it is the exact same mechanism of proxy warfare. Over the last few years, the United States established a clear precedent, providing real-time intelligence and advanced weaponry to an ally who is actively fighting a rival power is considered fair game.
It's an acceptable geopolitical maneuver that falls just short of triggering a direct uniform-on-uniform war.
The rules of the game.
Right, the rules of the game.
Exactly. And now Russia and China are simply adopting that exact same doctrine and applying it in a theater where the United States is deeply vulnerable. It is the strategic chickens coming home to roost.
But if you follow that logic to its natural conclusion, if Russia and China are actively helping Iran target U.S. military bases with precision intelligence, and the U.S. is fighting back, aren't we essentially fighting World War III by proxy right now?
I mean, we are undoubtedly in the opening phases of a global systemic conflict. It hasn't escalated to the point of direct uniform-on-uniform fighting between American, Russian, and Chinese troops, but the proxy engagement is total.
Yeah.
And you can see the physical reality of this global shift most clearly in how the world's trade routes are violently realigning. Because the Middle East is impassable for Western shipping, a vital trade corridor between Asia and Europe is being forced to reroute.
The ships have to go all the way around the Horn of Africa, which adds weeks to the journey and millions in fuel costs.
Millions. But overland trade is shifting too. The cargo is moving through the Middle Corridor, passing through Azerbaijan, Central Asia, and ironically right through Russia to reach European markets.
And while Western shipping is frozen or rerouted, the emerging Eurasian bloc is operating by its own rules.
The intelligence reports highlight a fascinating development in the Persian Gulf itself. China and Iran have apparently organized a localized security arrangement. Chinese tankers and Iranian vessels are guaranteed safe passage through the contested waters of the Strait of Hormuz.
So the drones and the missiles hold their fire when a Chinese flag goes by.
Precisely. The United States Navy and its allies are completely locked out of the waterway, while the emerging Eurasian economic bloc continues to trade unimpeded.
Wow.
This is the practical, physical application of a multipolar world. China and Russia are actively demonstrating to the global south that they no longer need the American Navy to secure global supply lines.
They can negotiate their own security architecture on their own terms, directly with regional powers.
It completely dismantles the long-held narrative of American indispensability.
Which perfectly brings us to the final and undoubtedly the most existential theme of this entire crisis. All the things we just discussed, the burning Patriot interceptors, the canceled global shipping routes, the proxy intelligence wars, the medical shortages, these are all just symptoms.
Right.
The underlying disease is the complete and utter collapse of the rules-based international order. Welcome to the cemetery of international law.
The term cemetery of world orders is incredibly precise. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we are witnessing the final burial of the post-1945 system. The system built on the UN Charter, international treaties, and the supposed mutual respect for sovereignty.
Let's trace how that system died here. Because this current catastrophe didn't happen in a vacuum. But the launch of Operation Epic Fury was the final nail in the coffin.
Yeah, it was.
The United States and Israel launched this war, specifically the preemptive decapitation strike on Ali Khamenei, by bypassing the United Nations entirely. There was no attempt to secure a Security Council resolution.
None.
There was no attempt to build a legal international consensus or present evidence of an imminent threat that would legally justify preemptive action under the UN Charter.
The framework of the Geneva Conventions regarding preemptive strikes, proportionality, and the protection of civilian infrastructure has been functionally discarded. And when the primary architects and historical guarantors of the international legal system, namely the United States and its closest allies, openly decide that the rules no longer apply to their strategic imperatives, the system itself ceases to exist.
It reverts to a Hobbesian state of nature.
It becomes a pure, naked exercise in hard military power.
And the tragic, catastrophic irony is that discarding those rules in an attempt to achieve a quick surgical victory has backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable.
Let's examine the outcome of that initial decapitation strike. The theory propagated in Washington was that killing the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, would immediately fracture the regime.
They assumed it would spark a massive popular uprising, and the Iranian people, exhausted by economic sanctions and internal repression, would rise up and welcome the destruction of their government.
It was a profound, almost willful misreading of Iranian nationalism, historical trauma, and political psychology.
Right.
Whenever a sovereign nation faces a sudden, unprovoked external existential threat, especially a decapitation strike by a foreign superpower, regardless of how deeply unpopular the government might be domestically, the population almost universally rallies around the flag.
The instinct for national survival just overrides internal political disputes.
Exactly. The strike did not shatter the Iranian government. It galvanized and consolidated it.
The power vacuum was filled immediately. The new leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the late leader, has stepped firmly into power. And he is reportedly heavily backed, perhaps even entirely controlled, by the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
And the IRGC is not a traditional military force. It is a deeply ideological, deeply entrenched paramilitary organization that controls vast swaths of the Iranian economy and foreign policy.
And unlike his father, Ali Khamenei, who maintained a long-standing religious fatwa against the development of nuclear weapons, claiming they were un-Islamic, the intelligence consensus is now absolutely terrified that this new, hardline IRGC-backed leadership will rapidly discard that fatwa.
They have the enriched uranium, they have the technical know-how. The consensus is that Iran will now aggressively pursue the assembly of a nuclear weapon purely as a mechanism for regime survival.
Because the logic of non-proliferation has been irrevocably shattered.
Exactly. If you are a nation watching this conflict unfold, the lesson is stark and undeniable. Diplomatic treaties will not protect you.
International law will not protect you.
Making concessions to the West will not protect you. The only thing that absolutely guarantees your national sovereignty against a superpower willing to launch preemptive decapitation strikes is a nuclear deterrent.
We are likely looking at a cascading, unstoppable wave of nuclear proliferation across the Middle East. Nations like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt will look at an armed Iran and feel absolutely compelled to acquire their own nuclear arsenals to maintain the balance of power.
That is a deeply unsettling prospect for global security. And the desperation driving this escalation isn't contained to the Iranian side. The military and economic analyses paint a remarkably grim picture of Israel's current strategic position as well.
Yeah, let's look at that. For decades, the overarching strategy has been to maintain total regional dominance, to ensure national security through overwhelming, unchallengeable offensive capability.
But that doctrine of deterrence through dominance has failed to deliver security in this specific crisis.
It really has.
Israel is facing a genuine existential threat, not just from Iran, but from a coordinated, multi-front war of attrition. With Iranian missiles consistently breaching their air defenses and dropping debris on major population centers, and Hezbollah aggressively expanding the scope of the war in the north from Lebanon with tens of thousands of rockets, the physical security of the state is heavily compromised.
And the economic toll is unsustainable. You cannot run a modern, highly advanced tech economy when a massive percentage of your working-class population is mobilized into the military reserves for an indefinite period.
No, business is close, foreign investment flees, and the national economy suffers severe long-term downgrades.
They are trapped in a war of attrition they cannot easily win and cannot easily afford to sustain.
Their interceptor stockpiles are depleting right alongside the Americans. The diplomatic isolation on the global stage is profound. The concept of deterrence has evaporated.
Iran is refusing to negotiate any form of ceasefire until it extracts a heavy punitive toll for the assassination of its leader.
Meanwhile, Israel feels it cannot halt military operations without securing a definitive, visible victory to restore its deterrent posture. It is a deadly, grinding stalemate.
Which brings up the darkest, most terrifying scenario discussed in this entire stack of intelligence. It is a concept analysts refer to as the Samson option.
Yeah.
And experts are openly terrified that it is no longer just a theoretical thought experiment.
The term refers to the biblical story of Samson, who, when blinded and captured by his enemies, pushed apart the pillars of the temple, bringing the entire structure down upon himself and everyone else in it. In military doctrine, it refers to Israel's unacknowledged policy of massive nuclear retaliation if the state faces imminent military defeat and destruction.
If Israel runs out of air defense interceptors, if the conventional military lines collapse under the weight of a multi-front war, and the state faces a true existential threat, there is a very real, documented fear that the leadership might resort to deploying nuclear weapons to stop the assault.
It is the ultimate nightmare scenario of the nuclear age. When conventional deterrence fails completely and a nuclear-armed nation is backed into a corner fighting for its very survival, with no diplomatic off-ramp available, the threshold for crossing the nuclear Rubicon drops precipitously.
The taboo against nuclear use, which is held since 1945, is suddenly extremely fragile.
Extremely.
Let me ask you this. Let's step into the shoes of a completely neutral nation right now.
Okay.
Say you are the leadership of a developing country in South America or Africa or Southeast Asia. You are watching this entire crisis play out on your screens. The lesson you are learning is that hosting a U.S. military base actually decreases your national security because it turns your country into a target for advanced drone swarms and ballistic missiles.
Right.
And furthermore, you see that the only real protection against unprovoked aggression or regime change is building your own nuclear weapon. Once every nation absorbs that lesson, how does the world possibly walk back from that paradigm?
It doesn't. It is incredibly difficult, perhaps impossible, to put the genie back in the bottle once fundamental trust in international institutions and security guarantees is destroyed.
We're in a new era.
We are entering an era of raw transactional geopolitics. Nations will no longer rely on global treaties or the goodwill of a distant, overextended superpower. They will form localized, highly pragmatic alliances based on immediate security needs and resource control.
The unified global order doesn't walk back. It fractures into heavily armed, defensive, and deeply suspicious regional blocs.
Exactly.
Okay, let's try to synthesize everything we've covered in this deep dive. The narrative of a swift, clean victory via Operation Epic Fury has completely unraveled. In just over 2 weeks, a span of merely 16 days, we have seen the dangerous depletion of the West's most advanced, expensive air defense interceptors, exposing the fatal flaws in defense contracting and industrial capacity.
Yeah.
We have watched the closure of the world's most vital energy choke point at the Strait of Hormuz, achieved not with massive naval fleets, but with cheap drones and the threat of asymmetric violence. Right, we are witnessing the real-time, undeniable collapse of American hegemony and deterrence in the Middle East. And the reverberations of this distant war are going to be felt directly in your life, in the price you pay at the gas tank, the cost of your grocery bill as fertilizer shortages hit the agricultural sector, the availability of critical medical care like MRI scans, and the very structure of global power.
The defining takeaway from all of this analysis is that this is not just another localized cyclical conflict in the Middle East that will eventually simmer down and return to the status quo. It is a definitive historical transition.
We are moving rapidly and violently from a unipolar American era into a highly fractured multipolar reality.
And in this new reality, as we have seen with the drone swarms overwhelming billion-dollar ships and targeted economic blockades crashing global supply chains, asymmetric warfare often trumps conventional military might.
The old rules of the geopolitical chessboard are gone, the pieces are scattered, and entirely new players are writing the rules as they go. I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over as you watch the news this week.
Okay.
We have talked extensively today about physical choke points, the Strait of Hormuz, the physical flow of oil tankers, the shipment of liquid helium and agricultural fertilizer. But as global supply chains fracture and nations begin hoarding physical resources to survive this chaotic new reality, what happens to the global internet and the free flow of digital information?
Oh, that is a terrifying question.
Right. If a physical choke point like the Persian Gulf can be completely shut down by a few hundred cheap drones and the mere threat of land-to-sea missiles, how secure are the undersea data cables that connect the entire global financial system?
It is the ultimate Achilles heel of our modern era.
Because, as it turns out, many of the most critical fiber optic data cables on Earth, the ones carrying trillions of dollars in banking transactions and communications between Asia and Europe, run right under the waters of the Red Sea, up through the heavily contested choke points of the Middle East.
Right through the crossfire.
If a nation or a proxy group decides that physical blockades aren't enough, dropping a depth charge or dragging an anchor across those cables could sever the digital spine of the global economy in an instant. If the physical world is fracturing, the digital world might be the next target in this era of unrestricted asymmetric warfare.
The vulnerability is absolute, and the blueprint for exploiting it is currently being written.
Something to keep a very close eye on in the coming weeks. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today. It is a complex, rapidly shifting world out there, but we will keep analyzing the data, breaking down the mechanics, and helping you make sense of the macro picture. Stay curious, stay informed, and we will see you next time.